In a corner of the world, erased from maps and memory, there lay a village scarred by war and silence. Burnt homes stood like hollowed skeletons, and the wind carried the cries of a time long gone. Among the rubble moved a quiet man named Jana, former mechanic, once known for fixing machines, now known for something far greater, trying to fix broken hearts. John lived alone in a half-collapsed hut. His hands were thick with grease and ash, his face lined with age and sorrow. Evening, as the sun dipped behind the jagged skyline, he emerged with a purpose. He gathered the village boys, many orphaned. Most hollow-eyed, and led them to a cracked courtyard where a soot-covered wall still stood, with a burned stick as his pen and dust as his paper. John began to teach. No salary, no blackboard, number, school, just the firm belief that if these boys could think, they could rebuild. He taught them math to count their blessings, history to know they were not alone, and stories, true and imagined, to help them dream again. He never raised his voice. He never punished. He only asked questions. And when he spoke, the boys listened not because they had to, but because his silence had taught them the weight of words. John once told them, power isn't in weapons or titles. It's in standing up when no one else does. The town had lost everything: hope, order, even its name. But in that dusty courtyard, under the broken sky, a forgotten mechanic had started something the world would one day remember. No one quite remembered how the teaching began. Maybe it was the day John saw a boy drawing numbers in the dirt with a stick, or the moment he found three brothers fighting over a single page from a torn book. Whatever it was, something stirred in John. He wiped the dirt clean and began to teach, not with rules or ranks, but with patience. They called it the Black Wall, the last standing piece of the old schoolhouse. John made it their classroom. It wasn't much, but under the whispering wind and broken clouds, it became sacred. The boys sat on bricks or bare earth, their faces lit not by electricity, but by wonder. John taught them how to read maps they'd never travel, solve problems bigger than their world, and recite poems of men who rose from nothing. One boy brought a rusted toy car with a missing wheel. He said it had belonged to his father, who died in the crossfire. John fixed the wheel with wire and tape, then said, "Your father gave you this. Now let it carry you forward." The boy wept, and the others looked at John differently from that day on, not just as a teacher, but as something unbreakable. Each lesson ended not with applause, but with silence, a respectful pause to let the knowledge settle. And sometimes John would stare into the fading sun and whisper, "They will not take your minds, What started as a way to fill the emptiness became a quiet revolution. One boy learned to count, another learned to speak without fear, and all of them learned what no army could destroy: the power of being seen and the strength of being taught. It wasn't long before whispers reached the ears of those in power. Soldiers stationed nearby began to take notice. A village teaching its young to read, to speak, to question, that, to them, was more dangerous than weapons. The boys noticed the shadows, first men in uniform, watching from a distance, muttering into radios. Then came the questions. What are they learning? Who is this John? Fear crept into the edges of their joy. One evening, after a lesson on ancient empires, the oldest boy, Amir, stayed behind. His jaw was tight, eyes burning with worry. "If they come for us," he asked, "will you run?" John looked at him not as a teacher, but as a father might, and said calmly, "Never. I don't teach cowards." That night, the soldiers came, boots stomped into the square. They dragged 5 boys from their homes, accusing them of plotting rebellion. Mothers cried, brothers screamed. The village stood frozen, but John did not. He walked through the darkness, past terrified families, past the barrel of a rifle, and into the command tent lit by firelight and fear. He spoke just once. "If they're guilty," he said, "so am I. I taught them to think. I taught them to hope." The room went silent. The commander, stone-faced, gave a single nod. John was taken. The boys were freed. No one cheered. No one spoke. He walked away without shackles, just dignity, and disappeared. Into the black of night, days turned to weeks. No news came. No body returned. The courtyard was empty now. The black wall untouched. The burned stick lay on the ground like a fallen sword. The boys returned, at first in silence, then slowly in whispers. They sat where John used to stand. Amir tried to teach, but his voice cracked under the weight. One small boy, barely 10, clutched the burnt stick to his chest and cried so hard he fell asleep in the dirt. The village was quiet, but not numb. John's absence was louder than his presence had ever been. A man who had no family, no fortune, no famiyet, left a wound too large to ignore. Some claimed he was executed. Others believed he was in prison. But most believed something greater, that John had not died, but become something bigger. Story, a lesson, a seed. On the last day before the rainy season, the boys gathered and wrote one word on the wall in chalk: legacy. It was the last word John had ever taught them. That night, thunder shook the sky. Rain washed the dust, but not the memory. He had vanished, but his echo remained. Years passed, the war ended, the guns stopped, the uniforms vanished, and the boys became men. One built a clinic, another a school. Amir became a statesman, not a politician hungry for power, but a servant with fire in his voice and his heart at the first town gathering in decades. The men stood before a crowd of villagers, students, and children. None wore suits, none claimed titles, but each began their speech the same way. There once lived a man named John. Tears filled the eyes of listeners who had never met him, but felt they knew him, because John was no longer just a name. He was a mirror of what one man could do when the world gave him nothing but silence, and he answered with hope. The old wall still stood. On it, in bold letters, was painted the John Center for Courage and Knowledge. No statue marked his grave. No date told his birth or death. But across cities and nations, his students carried his fire. And in every word they taught, every hand they held, every wrong they stood against, John lived on a forgotten leader who inspired millions